Hey guys, Tyler and George here from iRetroGamer. The video you're about to watch is a complete history on Sega Swirl for the Sega Dreamcast. Such an addicting, amazing game.
Oh, absolutely.
And no doubt, Slope has done an amazing job at uncovering all of the history on this very unique Sega title.
That's right, Tyler. So when you're done watching Slope go through an amazing deep dive over the history of Sega Swirl and show some exclusive footage, be sure to check out our video on iRetroGamer, which will be a companion video where we talk about our history with Sega Swirl and even on the beginning days of Dreamcast Online.
Absolutely. Well guys, without further ado,
welcome to Slope's Game Room.
What a weird game to give the complete history spotlight to. Yes, I know you guys all want to see me cover the bigger titles, and honestly, they are coming. But as this is my series of personal nostalgia-filled intrigue, I really wanted to cover that obscure Dreamcast game that practically every owner of the system at one point or another did play, but have completely forgotten. Sega Swirl, the other puzzle game that was also free, gave me and my housemate Shane at the time plenty of nights of enjoyment trying to beat each other's high scores. And even though I've briefly mentioned the game in my columns video I made a while back, I really wanted to dig a little deeper and find out exactly what the idea was behind this hidden gem, which, by the way, was bloody impossible. There is almost no documentation anywhere, and I wanted answers, which is why I went to the main guy himself to get the behind the scenes scoop on the whole Sega Swirl series. So, join me as we take a look into exactly why I, and plenty of others, love this obscure piece of Dreamcast history, as we look into the game's history, its development, the people behind it, and of course, the YouTube world exclusive look at the exceptionally hard to find Sega Swirl sequel. Welcome to Slope's Game Room. Yes, you heard me correctly. Feel free to pause this video now and search for Sega Swirl 2. Other than the odd wiki that says it actually does exist, as well as the odd screenshot in Google Images, there's absolutely no gameplay footage on the whole of the World Wide Web that actually showcases the game. In fact, for the longest time, I wasn't even sure it officially existed at all. Well, after speaking to Scott Hawkins, the game's designer, it most definitely does. And I, not to brag or nothing, actually have a copy of it. But hold up, before we look into this long lost Sega game, I think we're in fact getting a little ahead of ourselves. So, let's go back to the beginning. So here he is, Scott Hawkins. Any fans of classic Sega will know this guy very well, as he worked as a producer on some of the most iconic games back in the company's heyday, including such titles as Crazy Taxi, Sonic & Knuckles Collection, Bug, Virtual Fighter 2, Virtual On, NBA Action 98, Quake 3 Arena, and Condemned. But it doesn't stop there. After Sega, he not only worked on games like the episodic King's Quest games and Velocity 2X, but one day, when driving home and singing along to his radio, he came up with the idea for this little gem, which, for better or worse, basically spawns that whole SingStar craze a few years back. Yep, Scott has done a lot, but after looking back at all of the other games he was a part of, what stands up as one of his most fondest gaming memories? Why, Sega Swirl, of course. And that all started after going to a game developers conference one year where Scott sat in on a puzzle game development session, and after leaving, he felt inspired to make his very own video game. With a new skip in his step, Scott started working on the most basic game that he could test out his new skills and develop his very own game, obviously in his own time. A short 3 weeks after, a working prototype was made, and Scott showed it off to his boss, the COO of Sega, and he liked it so much that he not only suggested he continue working on it, but he also let Scott work on the game during work hours. This is on top of all the other games he was working on at that time too. Now, obviously he did, but that didn't stop him taking the game home and continuing on it until the early hours of the morning, practically all the time. Eventually, the basic swirly puzzle game quickly became an absolute passion project for Scott. However, bringing the game from a simple hobby and a test of programming skills into those Sega offices did, however, mean that it ultimately became Sega's property. Which really wasn't an issue, as I'm sure plenty of you guys can relate. The idea of your basic game possibly one day being published by the Big Blue is really a dream come true. But how was they going to release a game like this back in the days when downloadable minigames were not really too big of a thing? Well, it all started when Scott discovered an early online game of Scrabble that could actually be played via email. You take your turn, send the game on and wait for the other player to respond and send an email back to you. And this was when Scott thought to himself, you know what? I could make my swirly puzzle game do the exact same thing. Eventually, a prototype of the game working over email was made, and the pitch of the first ever online playable Dreamcast game was put forward when the president of Sega Japan came to visit. Scott showed him what he'd been working on and remembered him liking the idea so much that he stood up out of his seat and slammed his fists repeatedly on the table and said, "This game must be out by Thanksgiving." As you can imagine, Scott was thrilled. It's official, Sega Swirl was going to become a first-party Dreamcast game. What an amazing achievement! Well, there was just one problem. Scott hadn't even started the Dreamcast port of the game. And with Thanksgiving being only 2 months away, he knew that this was going to be a very hard task, as it had nowhere near the amount of spit and polish it needed to stand up against the Dreamcast's excellent looking games. With this in mind, Scott quickly tried to find a solution, and this is where Tremor Entertainment were working with Sierra to create Half-Life for the Dreamcast. However, as you may know by looking here at my bootleg copy of the game, it was cancelled because they basically didn't get the correct permission from a little known company called Valve, who actually did like the idea. They knew it made sense, but they wanted to pick the developer for themselves, which is why it was never released. Thankfully for Scott, he now had a company with nothing to do, ready to take on his Sega Swirl project, and boom! Just in time for Thanksgiving, Sega Swirl was printed onto 4 million discs, making it, by default, not only one of the most popular games for the system, but like I said earlier, the very first ever online playable Dreamcast game. Yes, even beating Choo Choo Rocket to the online table. But get this, not only was it the first online game for the Swirly system, but it was also the first to allow for cross-platform gaming. Yep, before this Dreamcast game, the PC version was released, which still had that email way of play, which obviously worked on the Dreamcast too. How cool is that? It's crazy to think that such a small game that is often forgotten about had such a rich history. But would you believe it? This little experiment turned first-party title for the system actually spawned a few pretty legendary landmarks for the system after its release. However, before we get into that, I think it's about time we look at the game itself. There are quite a few ways to get hold of this game, and if you want to play it on PC, well, there's a link in the description. But for me, back in the day, I was able to get the game on a Dreamcast demo disc with Dreamcast magazine. So here it is, Sega Swirl, with the game's main character Swirly the Snake, which, by the way, was used only because his tail could make a swirly shape. Basically, the game is incredibly simple, especially in this day and age of anyone that has access to an app store on their phone. Your job is to make the biggest combos possible and try your best to avoid all of the singles. That is it. Looking back at the script of this video, I just explained how to play this game in one sentence. But honestly, what more do you want? Sure, some of us crave the crazy nature of puzzle games like Puyo Puyo Tetris, but the majority like a game that could be worked out within seconds of playing, and Sega Swirl is exactly that. It's easy to learn, but tough to master. The game is bright, it's colourful, you got Swirly here keeping watch and reacting to the good moves and the bad moves you make, and at the end of every level you get to see what challenges you was able to tackle throughout your playthrough, which can also be seen mid-level as well. Failure to meet these challenges results in a game over. Like I said, the big draw here was the online email play, and for anyone interested in what that was actually like, can get the same experience by passing around the controller in local multiplayer mode. But obviously instead of a controller, it would be an electronic email. Like I said, a PC version was also released, although it's very basic compared to the flashy Dreamcast version, and there was also a limited Palm OS version too. So, like I said, the game actually ended up being shipped on over 4 million discs. Not only were fans of the Dreamcast happy with this little freebie, but Sega's employees were too. And when the employees had their monthly gaming tournaments inside the walls of Sega, would you believe that even with the huge lineup of games that they had at their disposal, from Afterburner to Zaxxon, they often chose this humble little title as the game of choice to earn Sega bragging rights amongst their colleagues. However, Scott was not allowed to play due to his unfair advantage. It's crazy, isn't it? It might not look like much, but Sega Swirl has quite an awesome history. In fact, you might not know this, but Scott actually ended up working on Quake 3 Arena for the Dreamcast because of his experience with online gameplay with Sega Swirl. And if you want to briefly divert even more, one of the roles of Scott's job after the release of Quake 3 Arena was to take out all those bastard PC players that honed in on the defenseless Dreamcast players, who were just there to have a good time. Yep, Scott got paid to play Quake 3 Arena. Anyway, a while later Scott went off to create his own development company called Codefire. And one of the first jobs he had within the company was to create that Palm OS version we spoke about earlier, which, again, is pretty simple with only a few minor changes put forward, like the changing of the shapes of certain colours in case your device didn't support colour, and of course some pretty nifty head-to-head play via infrared. As well as this port, the team also got to work on a browser-based port too. This again might not sound like much nowadays, but in the early days of the internet, this was quite groundbreaking. If you wanted to invite your friends to play this online version with you, all you needed to do is send them an email from the game, which would create a desktop icon that when you clicked on would boot you right up into the game playing with your friends. One of the quirkier things of all these games was the leaderboard. The way it would work is that your high score would get noted and sent to a special @Sega email address from your own personal email account. Scott would then gather up the data and put it all together, and you could see your high scores for almost all of the versions of the game. As you may have guessed, all of these quick-fire PC players that tick the box to get to the game without reading the T's and C's were very surprised to see that an email in there sent items going to this random Sega email address. And Scott remembers on many occasions receiving angry emails from fans of the game claiming that they never gave Sega this permission. But, obviously they did. Between those 4 million Dreamcast discs, the PC version, the Palm OS version, and of course the Shockwave version, Sega knew they had a hit on their hands, and even went as far as to create stuffed animals of Swirly the Snake to be given away to the top players. However, even though prototypes were made, this never ended up going ahead. But what did end up going ahead was Sega Swirl 2. When Scott created his own company, he worked on 3 Sega titles. We already talked about the Palm OS version of Sega Swirl, but he also worked on Sega Smash Pack for the Game Boy Advance, and obviously Sega Swirl 2. The game came about when Sega wanted to move further afield from the PC space, and one of the ways they did this was with GameTap.
Every year, hundreds of video games, just like these, are left unplayed. Sadly, this sort of neglect can affect any game character, at any time. Fortunately, there is hope, and that hope is the new world called GameTap. For just a few...
The idea behind GameTap was to pay a small fee each month to play every game between Pong and a generation or two behind the current generation. Again, something pretty impressive for the time. GameTap had made a deal with Sega to release on average about 200 games for their online service. And where they was only able to play the last few generations from everyone else, Scott had actually worked out how to port several Dreamcast games to the GameTap service. All the obvious games were added, plus one exclusive game, Sega Swirl 2. Now obviously with GameTap no longer being available, this means that Sega Swirl 2 is also no longer available. Now this game is the obvious next step for the franchise. You've got all the usual stuff you've seen so far, and the gameplay itself hasn't changed up all that much. The biggest changes are the new style in which the swirls move. Whereas before they would all fall down and to the left, in this game there are several different ways for them to move. Although personally after playing it a short while, the whole thing became a bit of a guessing game for me, and way too complicated for my simple mind. So I just stuck with the classic way of playing. There's also special boards that are shown in the daily section that sometimes are even holiday themed. Here's your Valentine's board, here's your Christmas Eve, here's your Halloween, here's your New Year's Day, Independence Day and Remembrance Day. The music you can hear in the background is actually taken from the game too. It's by a band called Kinetic, which was Scott's brother-in-law at the time. I'm not really sure if it fits Sega Swirl myself, and I much prefer the title screen and credits music, which, by the way, strikes an uncanny resemblance to Sonic Mania. Either way, it's a fun little game, and although it sadly doesn't include everyone's favourite elongated, legless, carnivorous reptile for a puzzle game, it is still no doubt the best version to play. That is, if you can find it. And that's really it. Will Sega ever release another Sega Swirl? Hell no. Of course they're not going to. But for people like myself, iRetroGamer and crazy amounts of other old school Sega fans, Sega Swirl remains a piece of classic Sega history that will live on forever. Again, it may have been a bit of a weird choice for a complete history, but in my opinion, it's a story that needed to be told. So, why not go blow off the dust from your demo disc or your browser or however it was that let you play the game, and let Swirly Snake constantly mock you. Hey there guys, thanks for checking out my Sega Swirl video. It's the part of the video where I give my usual shout out to my Patreons, but first, I want to give a big shout out to not only Scott Hawkins for telling me all about the past of Sega Swirl, as well as plenty of other things that we talked about, which I'm sure we will be bringing up sooner or later on this channel, but of course, I want to be giving a big shout out to iRetroGamer, who took me up on my offer of making this Sega Swirl video sort of a two-parter. Like I said at the beginning of the video, make sure you go and check their video out now. Link can be found in the description. But anyway, back to those Patreons, with a special shout out going to Matthew Ritter, Ryan Burford, Ian A. Chapman, Phil Lowlins, Justin French, Pop Goes Rock Band, Gavin Guravelli, Creamy Elephant, James Loveridge, Casey Garner, Blitz, Hedgie, Ben Hall, Taylor Allman, Sin Killer J. Takikawa, and Tiago Piera dos Santos Silva. If you want to be part of this list, as well as all the other things I do for my Patreons, then please click the link on the screen. I'll be even more grateful for your support on the channel, especially now considering YouTube keeps limiting ads all of my bloody videos. But anyway, be sure to subscribe, go and put it up on all the different social medias if you like doing that sort of thing. It really does help too. But for now, this is DJ Slopes signing out, and hopefully I'll see you all next time.